That one person at work, the one who just got told the entire department is being restructured, their job might disappear, and they just nod, slowly, and then go eat their sandwich like nothing happened. That's not trauma. That's not numbness. That's not even weirdness. That is Gen X. And today, we are cracking open the psychological vault that nobody, not the boomers, not the millennials, definitely not Gen Z, could ever figure out. The emotional deadbolt. The ability to shut down emotionally, instantly, cleanly, and almost surgically, like flipping a breaker switch on a fuse box inside their chest. Welcome. Buckle up. Because what you're about to hear is going to make you either deeply admire this generation or slightly terrified of them. Let's start with a scene. It's 1987. A kid comes home from school. They had a rough day. Their best friend said something cruel. They bombed a test. The teacher humiliated them in front of the class. They walk through the front door of the house, and their parent looks up from the TV. It's the news. It's always the news, and says, "Go make yourself a snack." That's it. No, "How was your day?" No, "Tell me your feelings, sweetie." No comfort circle. No emotional check-in. Just, "Go make yourself a snack." Handle it. And here's the wild part. That kid did. They went, made a peanut butter sandwich, watched some cartoons, and by the next morning, they were fine. Functionally, completely fine. That kid grew up to be a Gen Xer, and that one tiny repeated moment, multiplied over thousands of days across an entire childhood, is exactly what forged the emotional deadbolt. They didn't just survive emotional neglect, they weaponized it. Now, before anyone gets defensive, and I see you, Gen X, already crossing your arms, this isn't a bash session. This is actually one of the most fascinating psychological phenomena of the last 100 years of human development. Because what Gen X did, accidentally, through circumstance and survival, therapists and psychologists are now actively trying to teach people. Emotional detachment, psychological distance, the ability to observe your own feelings without being consumed by them. Monks spend decades in monasteries trying to learn this. Gen X learned it because their parents were busy and the latchkey was under the mat. Let's talk about the actual mechanics here, because this isn't just Gen X is cold. It's so much more layered than that. When something emotionally intense happens to most people, a breakup, a job loss, a betrayal, the brain floods, cortisol spikes, the emotional brain, the amygdala, basically hijacks the whole operation. You cry, you spiral, you text your friends 47 times, you make a playlist called Why Though? But Gen X, their neural pathways were trained differently. Repeatedly from childhood, their brain learned one very specific lesson. Emotions are not emergencies. Feelings are weather. They come, they go. You don't cancel your plans because it might rain. This is called affect regulation in psychology, and most people struggle with it their entire adult lives. Gen X just does it naturally. Like breathing, and it happened because of a very specific window of time, the late 1960s through the early 1980s, when the culture was shifting, when parents were exhausted, distracted, or simply working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, when divorce rates were climbing, when the social safety net was fraying, when children were expected to figure things out. The cultural message was loud and clear. You're on your own, kid. Figure it out. And figure it out they did. But here's what's interesting, and this is the part most people miss entirely. The detachment isn't emptiness. Gen X is not emotionally empty, not even close. They feel everything, deeply, privately, sometimes painfully. The deadbolt isn't about not feeling. It's about controlling when the feelings get to come inside. Think about it like a bouncer at a very exclusive club. The emotions line up outside. They're all there. Grief, excitement, rage, love, fear, joy. And Gen X has a bouncer at the door of their external expression who looks at each emotion and says, "Not right now. This isn't the venue." And that bouncer has been working that door since about 1979 and has never called in sick once. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because we're in 2026 now, and the conversation around mental health has never been louder. Every generation is talking about feelings, boundaries, emotional intelligence, therapy, inner child work, attachment styles. And Gen X is sitting in the corner watching all of it like they're watching a nature documentary. Fascinating. Look at them, expressing things out loud, not because they don't care, but because their entire operating system was built on the opposite model. And honestly, both models have value. That's the twist. Let me give you a real-life example that will make this click immediately. Two co-workers, one millennial, one Gen X. The company announces layoffs, big ones, could affect both of them. The millennial, and I say this with love because I'm not throwing shade, just painting a picture, immediately texts 3 friends, posts something cryptic on Instagram, schedules a therapy session, makes a vision board about what's next, and spends the next 4 days oscillating between panic and possibility. Gen X goes home, opens a beer, watches something completely unrelated, wakes up the next day, updates their resume, makes 3 calls to people they know, and has a backup plan by Thursday. Not because they don't care about the job, not because they're not scared, but because panic, to them, is a luxury they were never really taught they could afford. And here's the fascinating part. Research actually backs this up. Studies on resilience consistently show that the ability to regulate emotional responses under stress is one of the single greatest predictors of long-term success and recovery. Gen X, accidentally, through necessity, built this into their default settings. But let's flip this coin, because the emotional deadbolt has a shadow side, and we'd be doing this topic a disservice if we pretended it was all superpowers and sandwiches. The same mechanism that makes Gen X unshakable in a crisis can make them unreachable in a relationship. The same bouncer who keeps panic outside the door sometimes turns away the people who genuinely need to be let in. Partners, children, close friends. They sometimes press their face against the glass and wonder if anyone's even home. And someone is home. They're just not answering the door right now. This is the cost. And Gen X, if they're honest, and they usually are, bluntly, refreshingly honest. They know this about themselves. Many of them have spent years in adulthood slowly learning to unlock what childhood spent locking up. The deadbolt was installed for survival. But survival mode isn't meant to be a permanent address. Here's something wild. In 2026, we are watching one of the most fascinating generational dynamics in modern history. Gen Z is the most emotionally expressive generation ever documented. They talk about mental health, vulnerability, trauma responses, nervous system regulation. At 15 years old, they have vocabulary that took therapists decades to develop. And they're colliding in workplaces and family dinners and holiday gatherings with Gen X, who watches all of this with a combination of respect, confusion, and mild amusement. Gen X at a family dinner with Gen Z is basically 2 different alien species trying to have a conversation through a translator that isn't working properly. Gen Z, I just feel like this situation is activating my anxious attachment response. Gen X, did you eat today? Here's some food. Go outside. And the thing is, both of them are right. Both of them are healing in the only language they know. Gen Z learned to name everything. Gen X learned to survive everything. Imagine if you could do both. Let's go deeper, because I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough when we talk about Gen X. The specific cultural events that hammered this psychological pattern into place. Think about what Gen X grew up watching. The Cold War wasn't history to them. It was current events. They genuinely went to school some days, wondering if nuclear bombs might fall. They watched Chernobyl on the news. They watched the AIDS crisis decimate a generation of people they loved or looked up to. They watched economic crashes, factory closings, entire communities gutted by shifts in industry. And through all of it, the cultural message remained consistent. Don't panic. Don't make a scene. Keep moving. You want to know why Gen X doesn't spiral? Because spiraling seemed genuinely pointless when the backdrop of your entire childhood was actual civilizational anxiety. There's a psychological term called emotional economy. It's not an official clinical term. I'm using it conceptually. The idea that you have a finite amount of emotional energy, and how you spend it matters. Some people spend it freely, on every situation, every interaction, every moment of uncertainty. And some people, Gen X, learn to budget it tightly, carefully, reserving the big emotional expenditures for the things that actually warrant them. This is why Gen X will seem completely unbothered by something that sends other generations into an emotional tailspin, and then will surprise you with the depth of their feeling when something actually matters to them. A sick parent, a loyal friend in real trouble, a child in genuine need. That's when the deadbolt comes off, and what's behind it is so powerful, so real, so fierce. It can catch you completely off guard, because it wasn't emptiness all along. It was just stored, carefully, protected, for when it mattered. Now here's a question I want you to sit with for a second, and this applies whether you're Gen X, Millennial, Boomer, Gen Z, whoever's watching this right now. What if the thing that looks like coldness is actually a kind of quiet strength? What if "I'm fine" isn't always denial? What if sometimes it's a genuine statement of a person who has learned, through years of living, that they will actually be fine, that the storm will pass, that they've survived worse, that panic doesn't solve problems, but action does? What if we've been pathologizing resilience? Not always, not across the board. There are absolutely cases where "I'm fine" is armor over an open wound that needs attention. That's real, that's valid, and that's worth addressing. But there's also a version of "I'm fine" that comes from genuine earned confidence in one's ability to navigate difficulty. Gen X often speaks that second language fluently. Let me give you another example, because examples make this real. Gen X parent. Their teenager comes home upset. Something social happened. Drama, exclusion, the kind of thing that feels earth-ending at 17. The Gen X parent's instinct, their actual gut response, is not to sit down and process feelings for 45 minutes. It's to say something like, "That sounds rough. Those kids sound like idiots. You want to go get tacos?" And the teen, who maybe needed to be heard more explicitly, might feel slightly dismissed. But here's what they also got. They got a parent who wasn't panicking, which meant the situation wasn't a catastrophe. They got normalcy offered. They got forward motion. They got tacos. There's actually something deeply comforting about being around someone who doesn't catastrophize your pain. Sometimes what people need isn't someone to cry with them. It's someone standing steady, signaling that the ground is still solid. Gen X is really good at being that person. But let's get to the part that is genuinely changing in real time, because Gen X, and this is something I find beautiful, is a generation that is actively doing the work quietly, without making a huge announcement about it. Of course, they're doing it quietly. Their Gen X therapy rates among Gen X have been quietly climbing for years, not because they were taught to seek help. They weren't. But because they hit midlife and realized that the deadbolt that kept them safe as children was sometimes locking out the things they actually wanted as adults. Intimacy, vulnerability, real connection. And they're working on it. Not with a podcast and a merch line, just working on it, in private, With a therapist, they probably call the person I talk to because saying, my therapist, still feels slightly theatrical. Here's what I want Gen X to actually hear. Right now, if you're watching this, the fact that you survived a childhood that didn't give you what you needed, and you built a whole functional, capable, resilient life anyway, is not something to minimize or be ashamed of. It's extraordinary. The coping mechanism you developed, the emotional deadbolt, kept you alive and moving. It was brilliant. It was necessary. It worked. And now, in 2026, with more tools available, with more understanding of what emotional health actually looks like, you get to choose, consciously, when to use it and when to set it down. You always had the key. You just didn't know you could use it from the inside. And for everyone who loves a Gen X person, a partner, a parent, a sibling, a friend, here's what I need you to understand. When they seem unmoved during a crisis, they are not unmoved. They are moved. Privately, internally, completely. But they were trained to never let the weather show on their face because showing weather felt dangerous once upon a time. When they offer you solutions instead of sympathy, it's not because they don't care. It's because in their love language, solving your problem is the deepest form of caring they know. Action is affection. Showing up is everything. When they say, you'll be fine, they mean it as one of the most loving things a person can say. Because they've been through enough to know that you actually will be. They are the people you want in your corner when the world gets genuinely hard. Because while everyone else is processing the shock, Gen X already identified the exit, made the plan, and is calmly walking toward the solution. That is not a flaw. That is a feature that doesn't nut. Because we started with a kid coming home in 1987, sandwich in hand, feelings managed, world still turning. That kid is in their 40s and 50s now. Maybe their 60s. They've raised children, built careers, survived recessions and pandemics, and everything the last few decades have thrown at the world. They've buried parents and lost friends, and watched the world change in ways nobody predicted. And they're still standing, quietly, steadily, unbothered on the outside, complete universes on the inside. The emotional deadbolt wasn't a gift given to them. It was forged in the specific fire of a specific generation at a specific moment in history. And it made them, whatever its costs and complications, genuinely, remarkably resilient. In a world that sometimes feels more fragile than ever, where anxiety is at all-time highs and the noise never stops, there's something almost radical about a generation that can look at chaos and say, I've seen worse. Hand me a sandwich. Let's get to work. And maybe, just maybe, that's not something to pathologize or fix or explain away. Maybe that's wisdom. Hard-won, quietly held, unconventionally packaged wisdom. The emotional deadbolt isn't a prison. For the people who know how to use it, who've learned when to lock it and when to open it, it's one of the most powerful psychological tools a human being can carry. And Gen X has been carrying it for decades, without making a single post about it. If this video made you think differently about someone in your life, or about yourself, drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Are you Gen X, and you see yourself here? Are you a different generation watching this, and finally understanding that person in your life, who never seems rattled? Tell me everything. This comment section is a judgment-free zone. We are all figuring this out together. And if you want more deep dives like this, into the psychology of generations, human behavior, the strange and beautiful ways people are shaped by the worlds they grew up in, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because we are just getting started. Every week, we go deeper, we go stranger, we go more honest than most people are willing to go. And I promise you, you will never watch a video here and feel like you wasted your time. Subscribe, hit the bell. Tell a friend who needs to hear this today. And to every Gen X person watching this right now, you did good. You really did. Now go make yourself a sandwich. You've earned it.